it will be uncontroversial to point out that everything produced by humans is the product of their labor. But they require instruments of production to labor with, and natural resources to labor on. Thus, we find three factors of production: labor, instruments, and resources. According to Economics 101, as taught under capitalism, these three factors are labor, land, and capital, the capitalist holy trinity. And the owner of each is entitled to his reward. However, while it is clear that the laborer owns, if you will, her physical and mental exertions, that is to say, she cannot be separated from them, the same is not true of the landlord or the capitalist. Moreover, one of these three factors, capital, is simply the product of past labor. As stated before, everything that we produce, including capital, is the product of the only two real factors of production, labor and land being shorthand for natural resources. Setting capital aside, then, how should a crop of corn, for example, be divided between labor and land? The marginalist economist tells us, according to their contributions. Fair enough. But how do we determine those contributions? If we have Z bushels of corn, how do we determine that labor contributed X bushels, while land contributed Y bushels? The answer cannot be that the invisible hand will determine this for us, because we have no reason to believe that the hand, that is to say, a market system, will distribute according to contribution rather than something else. The marginalist economist, leaping to the defense of his God, the hand, claims to be able to show that in a market system the contributions of labor and land can indeed be determined, provided that neither holds a monopoly. His claim requires a fairly complicated explanation, but it is important that it be done, to reveal the underlying ideology, which has lent so much credence to marginalist theory. Take an example. Suppose that we have 5 acres of land and 10 laborers. Suppose further that the land is of uniform quality, and the laborers equally skilled. After harvesting, we have 100 bushels of corn. According to marginalist economics, we should now ask how many bushels land contributed, and how many labor contributed. That is, what is the marginal product of each? Suppose that one laborer worked all 5 acres and harvested 12 bushels. Now suppose that 2 laborers worked the 5 acres. We can assume that the harvest will be more than double, since the 2 will cooperate and benefit from economies of scale. Suppose that they harvest 26 bushels. Thus, the marginal product of the second laborer is 14 bushels, because adding their labor resulted in 14 more bushels. Now suppose 3 laborers. If they are still able to benefit from economies of scale, then perhaps the addition of the third laborer will result in another 15 bushels. Eventually, though, economies of scale give way to diminishing returns, the land is getting crowded. The increases continue as laborers are added, but each increase becomes less than the previous. On a graph, this will look like steps going up to a peak and then going back down. But suppose that we define the contribution of each of our 10 laborers as the marginal product of the last one added, and suppose this to be 6 bushels. Supposing this, we find that the contribution of labor is 60 bushels, and remember that our total harvest is 100 bushels. Why should each laborer's contribution be defined as that of the last? Is this not an arbitrary decision? Since we have assumed each laborer to be equally skilled, removing one will indeed decrease the harvest by 6 bushels, but if we remove 2, then it will decrease by more than their combined 12-bushel contribution. Why, then, should we focus on the contribution of the last laborer? Well, suppose that we reverse things and determine the marginal product of the 5 acres. Suppose that we set all 10 laborers to work at once, but have them work 1 acre, then 2, 3, 4, and 5. We will see the same process we saw with labor, increasing product with each acre of land, benefiting from economies of scale, then diminishing returns. More acres will continue to equal more corn, but less so than the previous acre, as workers are more thinly spread. Now, as before, suppose that we define each acre's contribution as that of the last. Again we will find the same results. Note that the contributions of both labor and land were determined technically, with no assumptions made about ownership. Now note the apparent problem. we have no reason to believe that contributions of labor and of land will equal our total harvest. And if they do not, then we clearly cannot have divided our harvest according to contribution, and the theory is shot. The thing is, in practice, if not in every hypothetical example, the theory does appear to work. And that is why marginalist economics gets away with making claims to intellectual rigor. But another thing is that in practice all manner of assumptions, such as those made in the previous example, are necessary to make the theory work. But if you make enough assumptions, then you can invoke Euler's theorem. Euler was a mathematician, which proves the theory using pure math completely detached from reality. But did you spot the elephant in the room? Or, I should say, the curtain hiding it from us? The elephant is the fact that nothing of the theory addresses the claims of the landlord. The curtain is the entire theory itself, which serves to obfuscate this fact. Also missing from the theory is a justification for the definition of the contribution of each laborer as that of the last, a definition that is indeed utterly arbitrary. This is a deceptive omission. To accept it is to accept the premise that each laborer is entitled to the amount that she contributed, according to the definition, but not more than that, for the rest is spoken for as well, you see. Both parties get what is due to them, thanks to the hand, barring any monopolistic distortions, which is to say, barring labor unions. Sadly for the landlord, these conclusions do not follow from the purely technical premises of the argument. Suppose that the 10 laborers work the 5 acres as a collective. Then the entire harvest of 100 bushels would go to them, not just 60 bushels. And this is the only reasonable scenario, for what is land going to do with 40 bushels of corn? Remember that we have made no assumptions about ownership. The landlord would have us believe that he represents land in bodily form, but any fool can see through this. What has happened here is that a trick has been played on us, by the choice of terms, by calling marginal product a contribution. A supposedly technical theory has pulled an ethical argument from behind our ear. The theory is supposedly meant only to determine the marginal product of labor and of land, in a detached and objective manner. But instead, marginal product of land has been conflated with ethical entitlement of landlord. Remember that land can be viewed independently of the landlord, unlike labor and the laborer. A contribution implies an entitlement, which is not the purview of the theory. We asked why we should think that the hand would reward the landlord based on his contribution. To answer the question by saying that a market system can correctly determine the marginal product of land is to dodge the question. We cannot determine the magnitude of the landlord's contribution. Thus we have a quantitative problem, but that quantitative problem stems from a qualitative one. We cannot determine the nature of the landlord's contribution. He granted consent to use his land, but aside from raising yet again the question of the legitimacy of his ownership of that land, this points to a glaring qualitative difference in the nature of his contribution and that of the laborer. His land is still his after the harvest. But the laborer's contribution, her labor, is gone forever. If she does not contribute fresh labor next season, she will get none of the harvest. But the landlord can go on contributing his land every season, without actually doing anything but grant consent, and keep getting his share of the harvest. The marginalist economists lied to us. Labor and land are not so symmetrical after all. They do not meet as equals on a level playing field. The irony of the theory is that by making its simplifications in order to invoke a mathematical theorem, it negates whatever legitimate contributions that the landlord might make. The theory paints him as a passive grantor of consent and nothing more. He does not plan, supervise, or do anything else but offer up his property on the altar of production. And this effectively removes him from that process and thereby nullifies the very claim that the theory is meant to justify. Granting consent is not productive. Production requires labor, and therefore laborers, and land, but not landlords.